You get that ink out of a cereal box, old man. The voice sliced through the quiet morning like cold steel, sharp with confidence that had never been tested by time. Arthur Hayes looked up only long enough to acknowledge the speaker before returning his attention to the steaming mug resting between his weathered hands. The small roadside diner sat less than 5 miles from Fort Liberty, where uniforms were as common as pickup trucks, and every breakfast conversation seemed to circle back to missions, promotions, or deployments. Sunlight poured through the front windows, catching dust floating lazily above polished tables, while an old country song drifted softly from a radio behind the counter. Arthur seemed untouched by any of it. At 82 years old, his silver hair was neatly combed beneath a faded baseball cap with no military insignia, and his denim jacket had been repaired so many times that every stitch carried its own quiet history. His left sleeve was rolled just high enough to reveal a faded black tattoo near his forearm, little more than an aged circle surrounding a simple 5-pointed star. Time had blurred its edges until it looked like nothing special at all. Standing over him were 2 Delta Force operators enjoying an unexpected morning off. Ethan Cole, broad-shouldered and impossibly confident, rested both hands on the booth as though he owned the room. Beside him stood Ryan Mercer, equally imposing but noticeably less eager to join the confrontation. Several customers slowed their conversations without meaning to. Forks paused halfway to plates. Even the waitress behind the counter found herself watching without realizing it. Ethan tilted his head toward the faded tattoo and smirked. I've seen unit patches from every major special operations group this country's ever had. Never seen that one. Guess somebody sold you a war story along with the ink. Arthur lifted his coffee with steady hands, took a slow sip, and placed the mug gently back onto the saucer. The silence lingered longer than Ethan expected. It wasn't fear. It wasn't embarrassment. It was something far more unsettling. It was patience. Ryan shifted his weight and quietly muttered, "Let's just grab breakfast." Ethan ignored him. "Come on, old-timer. You expect people to believe that's real." Arthur finally met his eyes. His pale blue gaze carried neither anger nor pride. It held only the calm certainty of someone who had long ago stopped measuring himself by the opinions of strangers. "No," he answered quietly. "I don't expect anyone to believe anything." The answer landed awkwardly, stripping the exchange of the argument Ethan had hoped to provoke. For just a heartbeat, the younger operator hesitated before forcing another laugh loud enough for the entire diner to hear. Convenient answer. Around them, coffee cups rested silently on tables. Outside, a Humvee rolled past toward the base entrance while a pair of helicopters crossed the bright Carolina sky, their distant rotor hum vibrating faintly through the windows. Arthur never glanced toward them. Instead, he traced one weathered finger along the faded outline of the tattoo, as if remembering something only he could see. Emily Brooks, the waitress who had served him every Tuesday for nearly 6 years, noticed the tiny movement. She had never seen him touch that mark before. Something in his expression changed so subtly that no one else would have recognized it. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't nostalgia. It was recognition, like hearing the first familiar note of a song no one had played in half a century. Ethan leaned closer, his smile growing sharper. "Tell me something, old man. If that tattoo actually means anything, why have I never heard of it?" Arthur Hayes let the question settle into the silence without rushing to fill it. The ticking wall clock behind the counter suddenly seemed louder than the conversations that had faded away. He wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic mug, feeling the heat against weathered fingers that had spent decades fixing engines, tying knots, and carrying memories that no photograph could ever preserve. His eyes drifted toward the rain-speckled diner window where the morning traffic rolled steadily past the entrance to Fort Liberty. "Because it was never supposed to be recognized," he said quietly. Ethan Cole laughed, the sound sharp, enough to make 2 young soldiers seated near the window exchange uncomfortable glances. That is exactly what someone would say when they cannot explain it. Ryan Mercer remained standing beside him, but his confidence had begun to soften. There was something about the old man that refused to fit the picture Ethan had already decided was true. Arthur never defended himself. He never claimed an elite background. He never mentioned medals, deployments, or decorations. He simply accepted every insult with the same calm expression, as though the conversation had already happened many times before with different faces wearing different uniforms. Emily Brooks walked toward the booth carrying a fresh pot of coffee. She smiled gently at Arthur before carefully refilling his cup. "Need anything else this morning, Arthur?" she asked. "No, thank you, Emily. Everything is just fine." Ethan watched the exchange with growing irritation. "You come here often?" Emily nodded. "Every Tuesday for almost 6 years. And he has always had that tattoo?" She glanced briefly toward Arthur's forearm. "As long as I have known him." Ethan folded his arms. "Funny. I have spent my entire career around special operations, and I have never seen anything remotely like it." Arthur looked down at the faded symbol. The black circle had almost disappeared beneath decades of sun, leaving only fragments surrounding the worn 5-pointed star. It no longer looked impressive. It looked forgotten. "Most things eventually become forgotten," Arthur said softly. Ethan reached into his pocket and removed his phone. Within seconds, he was scrolling through military insignia databases, unofficial archives, and unit recognition references that many service members proudly collected. He searched circles, stars, combined symbols, legacy patches, historical task forces. Nothing matched. Ryan leaned over his shoulder. "Anything?" Ethan shook his head. "Nothing. Not even close." He looked back at Arthur with renewed certainty. "That settles it." Arthur simply nodded once. "If that helps you." The answer somehow irritated Ethan even more than an argument would have. Outside, the distant thump of helicopter rotors drifted across the morning sky. Their steady rhythm echoed faintly through the glass, causing Arthur's eyes to lift for the briefest moment. Not toward the aircraft themselves, but somewhere far beyond them, as though another sound had quietly layered itself beneath the rotors, one that only he could hear. Emily noticed it immediately. The old veteran's breathing had slowed. His fingertips rested lightly against the faded tattoo, not protectively, but almost respectfully. It looked less like someone remembering an old design and more like someone greeting an old friend. She had served thousands of customers over the years. Business executives, military families, young recruits, retired couples. She had learned to recognize grief, pride, loneliness, and joy simply by watching faces across a breakfast table. What she saw in Arthur's expression did not resemble any of them. It resembled responsibility. Ethan stepped closer until he was standing beside the booth. "One last chance," he said. "Tell me where you got that tattoo." Arthur slowly raised his eyes to meet his. From 5 men who promised they would never need to explain it. For a long moment, no one spoke. The quiet inside the diner settled like fresh snow, soft on the surface, but heavy enough for everyone to feel. Ethan Cole stared at Arthur Hayes, waiting for some hint of exaggeration, some crooked smile that would expose the old man as another storyteller chasing attention. It never came. Arthur simply lifted his coffee once more, his movements steady and unhurried, as though the conversation had already reached its natural end. That composure only deepened Ethan's suspicion. He had spent years learning to read hesitation in hostile environments, years studying body language, deception, and confidence. Yet the elderly man sitting before him displayed none of the signals he expected. There was no defensive posture, no nervous glance, no attempt to impress anyone. It was almost as if proving himself had stopped mattering decades ago. Ryan Mercer looked again at the faded tattoo. The worn circle surrounding the weathered star seemed too plain to carry any real significance. Yet Arthur treated it with the quiet respect someone might reserve for a family photograph. Ryan found himself asking the question Ethan never considered. If only 5 men shared it, why keep wearing it? Arthur looked down at the faded ink. His expression softened, not with sadness, but with gratitude. "Because memories fade faster than promises," he answered. "Sometimes a mark is all that remains." Ethan shook his head with a dismissive laugh. "That sounds poetic, but it does not answer anything." He stepped closer until he could clearly study every faded line in the tattoo. There is no record, no unit, no archived task force. Nothing. Arthur nodded. "I know. Then how can you expect anyone to believe you?" Arthur smiled faintly. "I never asked anyone to." The answer landed harder than Ethan expected. Across the diner, conversations remained frozen. Even the cook behind the grill had slowed his work, pretending to wipe down a spotless counter while quietly listening. Emily Brooks stood beside the coffee station, watching Arthur more carefully than ever. She had heard veterans tell stories before. Some loved remembering. Others carried silence like a second uniform. Arthur belonged to neither group. He spoke only when someone asked, and even then his words seemed carefully measured, revealing almost nothing while somehow carrying tremendous weight. Her father had served with the Green Berets decades earlier. Before he passed away, he often repeated one lesson. The people who did the biggest things usually talk about them the least. That sentence echoed through her mind now. Ethan finally extended one finger toward the faded tattoo. Mind if I get a closer look? Arthur hesitated only briefly before resting his arm on the table. If it helps you understand, he said quietly. Ethan leaned in. The old ink was rough with age, its edges softened by more than half a century beneath the Carolina sun. There were tiny imperfections that no modern tattoo artist would intentionally create. It looked handmade, primitive, almost forgotten. Without thinking, Ethan brushed a fingertip lightly across the faded circle. The contact lasted less than a second. Arthur's eyes closed. His breathing slowed. Almost imperceptibly, the aroma of fresh coffee, maple syrup, and sizzling bacon seemed to disappear from his awareness, replaced by something carried from a lifetime away. Somewhere beyond the quiet hum of the diner, another sound began to return. A distant rotor beat rolled across his memory like thunder approaching through heavy jungle mist, followed by the faint crackle of an old field radio and the whisper of rain falling through towering trees. Arthur did not move. He did not speak. But for the first time that morning, it was unmistakably clear that the faded tattoo was not merely ink beneath aging skin. It was the doorway to a world that had never truly left him. The sound grew clearer with every heartbeat. The gentle clatter of dishes faded into the distance, replaced by the steady rhythm of helicopter blades somewhere beyond a ceiling of thick jungle leaves. Warm sunlight pouring through the diner windows dissolved into filtered green light dancing across damp branches. Arthur Hayes was no longer an old man sitting quietly in a roadside booth. For a fleeting moment, he was a young soldier again, standing ankle-deep in soaked earth, while humid air clung to every breath. Rain dripped steadily from towering trees, carrying the earthy scent of wet leaves and fuel that seemed impossible to forget even after half a century. A weathered field radio rested beside a canvas rucksack, its speaker crackling with fragments of voices that never used names, only short acknowledgments and coded phrases. There were 5 men gathered beneath a camouflage tarp stretched between the trees. No unit patches decorated their sleeves. No flags marked their position. Even their equipment carried no identifying marks. They spoke quietly, not because anyone had ordered silence, but because trust required very few words. One of the younger men held a small compass, while another carefully sketched a rough circle into the muddy ground with the tip of a knife. He placed a tiny 5-pointed star in its center and looked around the group with a faint smile. No paperwork, he said. No headlines. Probably no history books either. Another answered with a calm nod. Then we remember each other instead. Arthur watched without speaking, just as he always had. The oldest member of the team reached into a small canvas pouch and removed a simple hand-built tattoo tool assembled from ordinary field supplies. There was nothing ceremonial about it. No speeches. No dramatic promises. Only 5 men sitting beneath steady rain after completing a mission that would never officially exist. One by one, they accepted the same small symbol on their forearms. A weathered circle. A single star. Nothing more. It was not a badge of rank. It was not an award. It was simply a promise that if history chose to forget them, they would never forget each other. The memory shifted like mist moving through the trees. Dawn light filtered across an improvised landing zone where the same 5 figures stood beside a waiting helicopter. Rotors turned slowly overhead, stirring warm air and scattered leaves into gentle spirals. No handshakes were exchanged. No photographs were taken. One man adjusted his sleeve to cover the fresh tattoo before stepping toward the aircraft. Another smiled and said quietly, "If anyone ever asks about it." Arthur finished the sentence exactly as he had all those years ago. They were never supposed to know. The jungle slowly dissolved. The deep, rhythmic pulse of helicopter blades blended with another familiar sound until they became one. Arthur opened his eyes. The diner gradually returned around him. Coffee steamed gently from his untouched cup. Silverware clinked softly against ceramic plates. Outside, a pair of military helicopters crossed the Carolina sky toward Fort Liberty, their distant rotor hum echoing almost perfectly with the fading memory. Ethan Cole withdrew his hand, suddenly uncertain why the brief touch had left the old veteran so still. Arthur inhaled slowly and rested his fingertips over the faded tattoo once again. His expression remained peaceful, but something behind his pale blue eyes had traveled decades in the span of a single heartbeat. Ryan Mercer noticed it first. Whatever story Arthur carried, it was not one invented to impress strangers. It was one preserved by silence. Emily Brooks felt the same realization. Settled quietly over the room. She looked once more at the worn circle surrounding the faded star, then toward the telephone mounted behind the counter. For reasons she could not fully explain, she found herself believing that somewhere, someone would recognize that forgotten symbol. Emily Brooks stood behind the counter pretending to organize clean coffee mugs, but her attention never drifted far from Arthur Hayes. The entire diner had slowly returned to its usual rhythm, yet something invisible had changed. Conversations resumed in softer voices. Laughter sounded restrained. Even Ethan Cole seemed less certain than he had been only minutes earlier, though pride kept him standing beside the booth instead of walking away. Emily remembered sitting on her father's porch years before he passed away. He had rarely spoken about his time in uniform, but every now and then he would offer a sentence that stayed with her for years. One memory returned with startling clarity. If you ever meet someone who refuses to prove who they are, pay closer attention than you would to the loudest man in the room. Looking at Arthur now, she understood exactly what he had meant. She quietly reached beneath the counter and slipped her phone into her apron pocket. During a brief pause between customers, she stepped through the swinging kitchen door into the narrow hallway leading toward the supply room. The sounds of sizzling bacon and clinking dishes became muffled behind the wall. She opened her contact list and hesitated over one familiar name. Her uncle, Daniel Brooks, had retired from the Army years earlier, but now worked as a civilian liaison supporting headquarters operations connected with special operations units. He had once told her, half joking and half serious, that if she ever stumbled across something truly unusual near Fort Liberty, she should call before assuming it was nothing. Emily almost laughed at herself for considering it. What was she supposed to say? That an elderly customer had an old tattoo? It sounded ridiculous. Still, something deep inside refused to let the idea go. She pressed the call button. After 2 rings, Daniel answered. Everything all right? Emily lowered her voice. Probably. I just wanted to ask you something strange. He chuckled. Those are usually the interesting calls. She carefully described the faded tattoo. A worn circle. A single 5-pointed star. No lettering. No numbers. No visible unit designation. She mentioned Arthur's age, his calm reaction, and the fact that 2 active Delta Force operators had failed to identify it. The line remained silent for several seconds. Daniel finally spoke, but the easy humor had disappeared from his voice. Are you looking at it right now? Yes. Can you sketch it and send me a picture? Not the man's face. Just the symbol. Emily found a receipt pad, carefully copied the faded design exactly as she saw it, and sent the image. Less than 30 seconds later her phone vibrated. Daniel had already viewed it. Another pause followed, longer this time. When he spoke again, every word was measured. Emily, do not ask him any more questions. She frowned. Why? Because I do not know what I am looking at. That answer surprised her more than any explanation could have. Daniel had spent decades around military organizations. He normally recognized almost every insignia she had ever asked about. Then who would? She asked quietly. Someone above my level. Before she could respond, she heard keyboard clicks on his end of the call. I am forwarding your sketch to someone at headquarters. It will probably come back with nothing. His voice paused once more. But if it does not, I will call you immediately. Emily slipped the phone back into her apron just as another customer requested fresh coffee. She returned to the dining room, where Arthur remained exactly as before, quietly stirring his coffee while sunlight reflected gently across the faded tattoo on his forearm. Ethan and Ryan still stood nearby, unaware that a simple sketch drawn on the back of a receipt had already begun traveling through channels neither of them imagined existed. Daniel Brooks stared at the sketch on his computer screen far longer than he wanted to admit. The symbol refused to fit anywhere his experience told him it should. It was not listed among historical special forces insignia. It did not belong to any Ranger battalion, aviation unit, intelligence branch, or classified patch archive available through his civilian access. Yet something about the uneven circle surrounding the solitary star felt strangely familiar, like a face glimpsed decades earlier and nearly forgotten. Instead of dismissing it, he attached the image to a secure message and forwarded it to a duty officer supporting headquarters operations. The subject line contained only 4 words: possible historical identification request. Minutes later, inside a secure office at Fort Liberty, Major Stephen Caldwell glanced at the incoming message between routine reports. He almost archived it without opening the attachment. Curiosity changed his mind. He enlarged the simple sketch until the faded lines filled his monitor. His expression slowly shifted from mild interest to complete concentration. He searched multiple internal reference systems. Nothing. He contacted a records specialist responsible for legacy operational archives. Again, nothing. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and quietly whispered to himself, "Why does this look familiar?" Rather than closing the file, he forwarded it 1 level higher with a short note. Unidentified historical symbol. Recommend review. Across the installation, Colonel Rebecca Morgan was preparing for an afternoon planning conference when the message reached her tablet. She almost ignored it, assuming it was another request involving old military memorabilia. Then she noticed the attached sketch. She froze. Not because she recognized it completely, but because she remembered seeing something remarkably similar years earlier inside a restricted briefing book discussing historical operations whose details remained intentionally incomplete. She could not remember the operation. She could not remember the names. She remembered only one sentence printed beneath a grainy black and white photograph. Symbol intentionally omitted from all official records. The memory unsettled her enough to postpone her meeting. She contacted the archive office herself. No answer satisfied her questions. Every search ended with the same empty result. No designation. No surviving documentation. No explanation. She remained silent for several moments before forwarding the image once more. This time it traveled directly to the executive office supporting General Nathan Crow. The message contained only a single sentence. "Sir, this may require your personal review." Several miles away, General Crow stood before a digital display discussing future readiness with senior staff officers. Charts filled the room. Schedules, logistics, and operational planning covered the screens. An aide quietly approached and handed him a secure tablet, apologizing for the interruption. Crow glanced down, expecting another scheduling update. Instead, he saw the rough sketch of the faded circle and the single 5-pointed star. His eyes stopped moving. The room continued discussing troop readiness, but he no longer heard a word. He dismissed the screen with one hand and enlarged the image. Every uneven line seemed painfully familiar. He studied the imperfect circle, the placement of the star, and the slight break along one edge where the original drawing appeared worn by time. The color slowly drained from his face. One of the colonels noticed the sudden change. "Sir, is everything all right?" General Crow did not answer immediately. He continued staring at the sketch before quietly asking his aide a single question. "Where was this found?" "A small diner outside Fort Liberty, sir." Another long silence followed. Finally, the general closed the tablet, looked toward the officers surrounding the conference table, and spoke with calm authority. "Continue the meeting without me." No explanation followed. No discussion. He simply turned, picked up his service cap, and walked toward the door with measured steps that somehow carried unmistakable urgency, while dozens of miles away Arthur Hayes remained seated in the same booth, completely unaware that a forgotten promise had just awakened someone who had never expected to see that symbol again. The lunch crowd had begun to thin, leaving behind the comfortable hum of quiet conversations and the occasional clink of silverware against ceramic plates. Sunlight stretched farther across the worn hardwood floor, casting long reflections beneath the booths where only a handful of customers remained. Arthur Hayes sat exactly where he had been all morning, his coffee now nearly cold, his posture unchanged. Ethan Cole and Ryan Mercer had returned to their own table, but neither seemed interested in breakfast anymore. Ethan occasionally glanced toward Arthur, trying to convince himself that the old man was simply an unusually convincing storyteller. Ryan, however, had stopped searching for flaws in Arthur's words. Instead, He found himself wondering why someone carrying so much quiet confidence would invent a story that gained him absolutely nothing. Emily Brooks moved between tables, though every few moments her eyes drifted toward the entrance. She did not know what she expected to happen after her phone call, only that the uneasy feeling inside her had continued to grow. Then she heard it. The low, synchronized rumble of approaching engines rolled across the parking lot. Several customers instinctively turned toward the windows. Outside, a line of dark government vehicles entered the lot with deliberate precision. None of them activated emergency lights. None of them hurried. Their slow, controlled arrival somehow attracted more attention than speed ever could. The engines became silent almost together. Doors opened. Men and women in neatly pressed uniforms stepped out with calm professionalism, their expressions composed and unreadable. The conversation inside the diner faded until only the soft sound of the ceiling fan remained. Ethan frowned toward the parking lot. What is headquarters doing here? Ryan leaned closer to the window. I have no idea. The front door opened with the familiar chime that had greeted customers all morning. This time the sound seemed strangely louder. A senior aide entered first, quietly scanning the room before stepping respectfully aside. Behind him walked General Nathan Crow. His service uniform was immaculate, every ribbon perfectly aligned, every movement measured with the confidence of someone long accustomed to command. No one announced him. No one needed to. Every service member inside the diner recognized him. Immediately, chairs shifted. Conversation stopped entirely. Ethan and Ryan rose to their feet almost automatically, surprised to find themselves standing at attention before they had consciously decided to move. General Crow acknowledged no one as he entered. His eyes moved slowly across the room, passing tables, windows, and startled faces until they settled on a single elderly man sitting quietly with one hand wrapped around a coffee mug. Arthur looked up calmly, showing neither surprise nor excitement. For several long seconds, neither man spoke. The silence carried a strange familiarity, as though two people separated by decades had somehow continued the same conversation without missing a single day. Emily watched from behind the counter, holding a coffee pot she had completely forgotten to set down. Ryan sensed something unfolding that reached far beyond ordinary military protocol. Even Ethan, whose confidence had filled the room only an hour earlier, suddenly felt uncertain for reasons he could not explain. General Crow took one slow step forward, then another. He stopped beside Arthur's booth without speaking. His gaze lowered to the faded tattoo resting on the old veteran's forearm. Arthur followed the general's eyes, then looked back up with the faintest hint of recognition touching his weathered face. Neither man smiled. Neither reached for a handshake. Instead, the general slowly unfastened the button on his left sleeve. Every person in the diner unconsciously leaned forward, sensing that the next simple movement would answer questions no database, no archive, and no official record had ever been able to explain. General Nathan Crow slowly rolled back his left sleeve. The movement was unhurried, almost ceremonial, as if every second carried its own weight. The room became so quiet that the soft ticking of the wall clock could be heard from every corner of the diner. Arthur Hayes never looked away. Neither did Ethan Cole. As the fabric folded above the general's forearm, faded black lines emerged beneath skin weathered by decades of service. First came the worn circle, then the single five-pointed star resting perfectly at its center. It was not similar. It was identical. Even the slight break along one edge matched the sketch Emily had drawn only an hour earlier. A quiet gasp escaped someone near the window. Ryan Mercer blinked twice, convinced his eyes had betrayed him. Ethan simply stared, unable to force another word from his mouth. General Crow lowered his arm beside Arthur's. The two faded tattoos rested only inches apart, separated by decades, but unmistakably connected by the same forgotten promise. Arthur smiled for the first time that morning, a small, genuine smile that carried recognition instead of surprise. "It has been a long time, Nathan," he said softly. The general answered with equal warmth. "Far too long, Arthur." Then, without another word, General Crow took one deliberate step backward. His shoulders straightened, his chin lifted. Before every stunned customer in the diner, before two Delta Force operators who only hours earlier had questioned the old veteran's integrity, the commanding general raised a crisp salute. Arthur looked at him quietly for a brief moment before returning the salute with calm precision. Neither gesture felt rehearsed. They looked like two men continuing a tradition that time had never managed to erase. No one else moved. No one reached for a phone. Even those who had instinctively considered recording the moment slowly lowered their hands. Somehow it felt too personal, too honorable, to interrupt with a camera. General Crow finally relaxed his salute and turned toward Ethan and Ryan. His expression remained composed, but his voice carried the unmistakable authority of a man speaking from both experience and responsibility. "Gentlemen," he said, "you searched every database available to you because you assumed history always leaves records. Sometimes it does not." Ethan swallowed quietly, unable to meet the general's eyes. Crow continued, "There were missions conducted by men whose names were intentionally protected, not because their service mattered less, but because their sacrifice demanded silence instead of recognition. Not every brotherhood was built for public memory." He looked back toward Arthur with unmistakable respect. "The symbol you questioned was never a military decoration. It was a promise shared by 5 men who completed an assignment that officially never existed. 4 of them continued serving in different ways. One chose a quieter life. None of them ever spoke about it because that was the agreement they made with each other." Ryan slowly understood why every search had failed. There had never been anything to find. Ethan felt the confidence that had carried him through the morning quietly dissolve into humility. He had mistaken incomplete knowledge for complete understanding. Arthur rested his hand lightly over the faded tattoo once more. "We never expected anyone to remember," he said. General Crow nodded. "That was never the point." Sunlight reached across the booth, illuminating both worn symbols together for the first time in decades. Around them, the entire diner remained perfectly still, not because anyone had ordered silence, but because respect had quietly replaced curiosity. And in that ordinary roadside diner, everyone present understood they had just witnessed something far older, far rarer, and far more meaningful than any official record could ever preserve. No one hurried to speak after the general's words settled over the room. The silence itself became part of the moment, carried gently beneath the steady hum of the ceiling fan and the distant sound of helicopters crossing the Carolina sky. Arthur Hayes reached for his coffee one final time. It had grown cold, but he did not seem to notice. He took a slow sip, set the mug carefully onto the saucer, and looked across the table at General Nathan Crow. "You still drink yours black," Arthur said with the faintest smile. The general allowed himself a quiet laugh that seemed to erase decades in a single breath. Some habits survive everything. Around them, the tension that had filled the diner all morning quietly transformed into something else. Nobody saw an old veteran anymore. Nobody saw a retired general. They saw 2 men connected by trust that had outlived time itself. Ethan Cole stepped forward, his confidence replaced by genuine humility. For several seconds, he searched for the right words, only to discover there were not many. "Sir," he said softly, looking first at Arthur and then at the general, "I was wrong." Arthur looked up without the slightest trace of resentment. "We have all been wrong about someone at some point," he answered calmly. "The important part is what you choose after you realize it." Ethan nodded slowly. That simple sentence carried more weight than any lecture he had received during years of military training. Ryan Mercer extended his hand toward Arthur. This time there was no challenge behind the gesture, only respect. Arthur shook it firmly before standing from the booth. The old denim jacket settled naturally across his shoulders, hiding most of the faded tattoo once again. It disappeared beneath the sleeve as quietly as it had lived for decades. Emily Brooks walked over holding the breakfast check she had printed earlier. She looked at Arthur, then at the general, before gently tearing the receipt in half with a warm smile. "Breakfast is taken care of today," she said. Arthur reached for his wallet anyway. Emily shook her head. "Please let us have this one." Arthur hesitated only a moment before placing the wallet back into his pocket. "Thank you, Emily." She smiled. "No, thank you." General Crow walked beside Arthur toward the entrance instead of allowing him to leave alone. Every uniformed service member inside the diner instinctively stepped aside, creating a quiet path without anyone giving an order. As Arthur reached the door, he paused and looked back across the room. His eyes met Ethan's one last time. "Never judge a person's story by what you can search," he said. "Some chapters were written only for the people who lived them." Ethan lowered his head with quiet understanding. Arthur pushed open the door, and the familiar bell above it rang softly into the afternoon air. Warm sunlight spilled across the sidewalk while a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine from the nearby trees. General Crow remained standing at the entrance, watching his old friend walk toward an aging pickup truck parked near the edge of the lot. Arthur climbed inside, started the engine, and drove away without fanfare. No escort followed him. No cameras recorded his departure. Within moments, the truck disappeared beyond the curve in the road, leaving only the fading sound of its engine behind. The general looked toward the empty highway for a long moment before quietly rolling his own sleeve back into place, covering the faded symbol once again. Some stories belonged in museums. Others belonged only in memory. As the diner slowly returned to its ordinary afternoon routine, everyone present carried home something no official archive could ever preserve. They had learned that respect is not earned through recognition, rank, or applause. Sometimes the greatest lives are the ones history intentionally leaves unnamed, and some salutes truly do last a lifetime.